I'm Greg Hunter. Welcome to USAWatchdog.com. With us, a return visit by the one of the authors of this book, Prosper. This is the Peak Prosperity folks, and one half of it's Adam Taggart and also Chris Martenson. Chris Martenson, thank you for joining us today on USAWatchdog.com.
Greg, it's great to be back with you and all your listeners.
Yeah, this is in the second edition, Prosper, that you've. It must have been a popular book if you did another edition on it then. So it was popular the first time, and maybe you're taking another run at it here with new information, correct?
That's right. We updated almost every chapter, added another one, put some more information in because, let's face it, the world's a moving target. Lots of things happening all the time. So, yep, we're very happy to have that second edition out and corrected a couple of typos that were bothering us. So it feels good. It's a good second edition.
You got a conference coming up out in California at the end of April. We'll talk about that at the end of the interview. Nice that you brought up the moving target because you must have a group of things that you're going to talk about, and then we have to add this. We should add this too. This just happened. So we got to. I mean, what a moving target, but what a great conference. Your conferences are very popular. I've had people write me and say, I went to that, and that was pretty, I saw it online. I thought that was, anyway, we'll talk about that at the end. I want to talk about what one of your most recent articles, and now you said the crash is here, and the signs of the crash is here, just beginning, are all over. Will you start with, tell us why you think the crash is here?
Well, absolutely. We track three things as part of our model at Peak Prosperity. We track the economy, of course. We talk about that a lot. Also energy, particularly oil, and the environment, ecology, right? So those are the three E's that we're tracking all the time. And when we look over in the ecological space, there are so many warning signs that say that humans have pushed up against the limits, that we are collapsing various ecosystems. And this is simple stuff like the ancient baobab trees are 2,000 years old in Africa. They're dying. The ancient kauri trees in New Zealand are dying. For some reason, trees all over the world are dying. Insects, 98% of the ground insects in Puerto Rico and their nature preserves are gone. Your windshields are now clean compared to how they used to be. The monarch butterflies down 85% last year compared to the year before in California. They're in danger of extinction, we think now. When we look at fish species, phytoplankton, I mean, come on. Everywhere we look, we see that there are signs of ecological collapse. We don't know what they are caused by yet. It's a complex system. It's really hard to tell, but it's just tragic. Songbirds are disappearing like crazy. This is happening, and it's happening on our watch. People are starting to figure that out. It's scary. And then you go over to the Davos conference, which is really the World Economic Forum, and all they're talking about there, Greg, they said, here are 4 ways we think the future unfolds. It's going to be really fast economic growth, sort of fast, kind of slower economic growth, or lots of growth, right? It's just growth, and that growth is killing us, and we need to figure out some other way around this right now, so it's happening. And our prediction at Peak Prosperity is that these collapse trends that we've been following for 10 years now are accelerating. They're continuing. None of them are reversing yet at this point in time. These are really going to impact people's futures in a huge way. And that's a big part of what we're talking about is ecologically, environmentally, we see these signs. But we also have $245 trillion of global debt in the economy, and we've been accelerating that debt cycle as if we could just keep that trend going forever. We can't. So what we see are all these unsustainable trends. They're converging. They're going to happen over the next few years, and people need to be ready for those. And they already know. Like if you're an outdoor person at all and you've spent any time outside, you already know what's happening in terms of the amphibians disappearing. They've got some weird sort of a fungus thing that's been attacking them. All sorts of species are being attacked for all sorts of different reasons. Our view is people go, well, maybe it's a natural cycle in the amphibians. Maybe it's natural cycle in the insects. Well, if you have, as they say in the military, once is an accident, twice is coincidence, but 3 times, that's enemy action. So we have dozens of things happening all at once. Looks like enemy action to us. We think this is going to have a huge impact, particularly once the world decides we can't grow like we've been growing. That is without thought, exponentially, like we're going to grow infinitely forever. We can't do that anymore. So what comes next? Well, guess what? stocks and bonds are all priced for perfection, as if we're going to grow forever and ever and ever. Hey, Hosanna, amen. And it's not going to happen. So people need to be ready for that. That's really our point of view here. And, just financially, there's tons that people need to be looking at here, too, and being ready for.
I got that wrong. I said the crash. It's really the collapse.
It's collapse is the word we're using. That's correct.
Collapse is here. Forgive me for that. I'm sorry. Collapse, crash. I mean, it kind of means the same thing, but it's collapse. The yellow vest thing. I mean, the geopolitical strife is not even being covered on the nightly news. I mean, it's pretty unbelievable. It's being covered in the alternative space. It's being covered with you because you think this is a big beacon. The yellow vest protest in France. What does it mean?
Well, it's a very important movement, and it's coming from really the same pressures that I just talked about a second ago here, and it's coming from the idea that there's a very, very, very tiny group of elites that are harvesting their fair share, right? They're taking what they're used to taking, and the economic pie isn't expanding anymore. It's kind of stagnant. So if you have one tiny group taking their fair share and the pie isn't growing, it means they're taking from somebody else. This is the essence of central banking. They don't create wealth. Your listeners know this. They redistribute wealth. When the Federal Reserve crams interest rates to zero, well, the savers lose out. But lose to who, right? Well, there's a winner in that story. So the winners and the losers are being picked by the elites, by the central banks, and they've decided that the 0.01%, and that we can use that term now, should be the winners in this story, and that everybody else should be the losers. Well, guess what? The people of France have a long, sort of storied history of detecting these usurpations, as it were, these insults, and they protest about it. Plus, France is a logical place for this to have sort of shown up because they have very high tax rates and a very bureaucratic government that doesn't listen well to the people. So you put all that together and the people explode. Finally, they say enough. This wasn't about a diesel tax. That was maybe the last straw, the spark on the tinder pile, right? But what happened was ordinary people said enough. We can't live. They've got speed cameras harvesting us for, euros every time we go a little bit too fast. We've got all these new taxes and rules, and we're getting cost of living adjustments that are way below the true rate of inflation that we're experiencing. And it just became too much. So if you look at the Yellow Vest movement, what's really notable, Greg, is they're just people. Old people, young people, veterans, but it's mostly the middle classes and the lower classes who've just been getting abused. Meanwhile, the French police have been truly atrocious. They are using these so-called flashballs, which are very high projectile rubber bullets. They're about 40 millimeters across. They come out at a very high rate of speed. And if you look at the weapons the police are using in France, they've got very fancy high-tech red dot holographic sights on there, meaning they're aiming precisely. And then you look at 1,300 people who have been injured over there, and you see a lot of head wounds. So the police are very specifically, very violently aiming for the heads of these protesters in particular, picking out who they think the leaders are.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, so this is all happening. 1,300 people grievously wounded. So lots of people have lost eyes. 4 people have lost hands from the concussion grenades that have gotten lobbed at them. Of course, they're using tear gas from helicopters in some cases. So it's really aggressive. And here's the notable thing. Nobody's covering it. It happens every Saturday. Sunday and on Saturday, I go to the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times. I go to Le Monde, the French newspaper. I go to the BBC and I say, what do I see on the front page? And the answer is nothing. There's even rumors out that in the BBC has what's called a D notice, which they hand out under very rarely used to be under national security times. They would say, for national security reasons, we are not going to be reporting on these sorts of subjects. You can't talk about them. They handed one out under the Skripal case, which was the poisonings. They didn't want a name of a certain former MI6 operative out in the press, so they put out a D notice then. And apparently they put one out again because they don't want the people of Europe having the equivalent of an Arab Spring. They don't want this spreading, but it is spreading. We've seen yellow vests show up in Australia, Brussels, in the UK. I think we've even seen a small set of groups in the United States. And what this movement is ordinary people donning a yellow vest and saying, enough. We are tired of being squeezed, and we have no say in the political process. We have no more economic power or clout. Our oxygen's being sucked away from us and economically by these rapacious corporations and the elites. And that's the trend that if you wander over to Davos, the elites over there who showed up in their 1,500 private jets talking about climate change and other ironies, they had a number of conferences talking about how worried they are that people are getting angry. They just don't know what to do about it, because to do something about it means to be less greedy and not rig the game so that it works only for you and not for anybody else. And that's what the pressure is we're seeing right now.
Well, aren't they isn't the EU who were talking up this whole idea they were going to stop with the bond buying, and now we're talking about buying the debt of these people? I mean, they've got all their money in debt, and then they're going to stick the sovereign debt onto the backs of people, because it was corporate debt in 2008. Now they're sticking all this debt on the backs of the people, and they stole their money fair and square, damn it, and they're going to get it, right? I mean, isn't that what's going on?
That's right. So look, the central banks of the world, and let's take the big ones. So that's the People's Bank of China, Bank of Japan, the European Central Bank, and the Federal Reserve. Collectively, they put out, 15 trillion new dollars of printed dollars. They called it quantitative easing, which means they printed money out of thin air and bought real things, the debts of corporations, the debts of countries, and things like mortgage-backed securities, or in the case of Swiss National Bank or the Bank of Japan, equities, Apple stock, GE, whatever they were buying, right? So they did this, and what happened was the theory they had, which is a stupid theory, was that somehow this would be good for everybody. It turned out it was fantastic for the people who owned those things that they were buying. So the owners of those bonds and stocks got fantastically wealthy, right? So now they tried to reverse that just a little bit. And for the first time, somewhere around between June and November of last year, central bank balance sheets actually stopped growing. They weren't growing more, but they stopped growing. And what happened was we saw volatility, which was stocks started to fall a little bit, and they freaked out. The Federal Reserve has already caved and backed off and said, well, maybe not as many, or maybe no more rate hikes. And maybe what if we did stop our bond runoff program? So they're talking about stopping their tightening. And today, which is Tuesday, the 29th of January, we saw on the back page of the A section of the Wall Street Journal, they floated the little idea that the European Central Bank has decided that maybe they will reverse their program as well, meaning they were going to stop buying more corporate bonds. Maybe they need to buy more if they have to. So already they're saying they're going to do more of this stuff, which has done what for us? It's driven up the prices of stocks. It's driven up the prices of bonds. It hasn't resulted in any wage gains, really, that are appreciable for most people. And it's really benefited the elites at the expense of everybody else. And this brings up the most important point. Central banks are not our friends. They are redistributive organizations. They don't create wealth. They redistribute it. So the only question you have to ask when you see all the wealthy getting super wealthy is, where did that wealth come from? And the answer is, it comes from everybody else. And that's what the central banks have been doing. They are unelected, and they are picking winners and losers. And they've decided that the people they rub elbows with at parties ought to be the winners. And boy, they've succeeded. They've been very, very successful at that. But they've really been losing the larger war. They won the battle, but they're losing the larger war. And so already they're saying, we're going to keep doing that, because that works for us.
In 18, didn't they gain like 150 or 70, or didn't they gain $1 billion? Didn't they gain in 2018?
Who, the Davos crowd?
Yeah.
Yeah, they 100%. Their collective net worth increased by 175 billion. Increased, right? It's just an astonishing number. And so if you look at a long-term chart of the stock market in the United States, you see bubble 1 in 2000, bubble 2 in 2007. Bubble 3 here has been this absolute hysterical blow-off top since 2016, when they freaked out and threw the most amount of money into the markets. The central banks of Europe and Japan, making up for the United States holding off a bit. They threw the most amount of money we've ever seen in the crisis since it started in 2009. And what did we see as a result of that? We saw this furious blow off top. And now they're afraid of that, retracing it all. Like every time they blow the bubble to a new height, it's like, well, that's the correct price. We can't have stocks come back from there because that's the right price. So you have a group of roughly 100 people in the world who know what the correct price is for all the equities, all the real estate, and all the bonds in the world. And the Soviet Union showed that a small group of unelected people can't manage an economy. But you have the central banks now literally day trading the markets in order to keep them at their correct prices. And those happen to be the correct prices for people who own those assets, but it's not the correct price for anybody who would want to buy those assets. So again, winners and losers, the Federal Reserve et al. Are saying those who already own those financial assets should have them at elevated prices. Anybody else who wants to buy into those shall have to buy them at extremely elevated prices. So guess what, millennials? No, home ownership rate formation and is starting to be very, very low and depressed in an entire generation because the Federal Reserve said houses should be expensive in California. Therefore, anybody who wants to buy a house is going to have to pay up. Oh, you're going to have to take on a lot of debt. Oh, you're going to have to be a debt slave, right? So this whole thing, this is infuriating. This is why the yellow vest movement can't be not publicized fast enough because the elites don't want people to be able to express how angry they are at being shafted. So that's all that this is about. And this needs to be corrected. It's unfair. It's always been unfair. It has nothing to do with democracy or free markets or market stability or any of that other junk they talk about, Greg. This is all about the elites maintaining their power and control, and they don't know what else to do, which is why we talk about how you and I and everybody listening to this has to be ready for what's coming. Because things like this usually don't end well. They end in a social eruption, which is what they're afraid of with the yellow vest. They end up in a market eruption at some point in time. Or if it ends up in an ecological eruption, one way or the other, this ends badly if we don't ourselves manage the process, see the signs for what they are, willingly walk away from the precipice. But nobody in power wants to do that right now. They all want to continue the game as it is being played, and that has a very dark path, I fear.
Can they keep the collapse from obviously they can't keep the collapse from happening. That's your premise, is that if you look at all the stuff, they cannot keep this collapse from happening. It's like they're just sliding down the mountains. They're just losing ground slowly. At some point of this, is it just going to go bink? They're just going to go at full, at terminal velocity, the fall?
Well, that's unfortunately, we think there's two paths. That's what I wrote about in this last piece where I was writing about how collapse is already happening. Two paths before us. One is just keep going as is. Do everything you can, Band-Aids, chewing gum, baling wire, to keep things just going for a little bit longer, right? So throw more money at the shale drillers, even though they're all losing money, and just rip that last oil and gas out of the ground as fast as possible to keep the market's well supplied with liquid fuels a little longer, or just ignore what's happening with the insects. Hey, maybe that won't be such a big deal, right? Or whatever. That's path A. You keep going, but then something breaks, right? Your fingernails let go of the edge of the cliff and off you go, right? Path B, which is the one we prefer, is we say, look, it's not perfect. We don't like looking at this hard stuff. We wish we weren't here, but here it is. We have to make some very hard choices now, including maybe we live beyond our means with debt for a while, so now we have to live below our means. Austerity, very unpopular politically, but it's a reality sometimes. Or if we're beyond our limits ecologically, what do we need to do to dial that back? Maybe it's not important for Monsanto and Syngenta and Bayer to make more money selling the poisons they do. Maybe we should just reel back a couple of the recent additions that they put on the market in the last 20 years when things started to really go haywire. So path B is insight, path A is pain. Our view is that humans tend to be, we prefer to change through pain, I guess, is kind of how we look at it. So we don't see a future for path A. Business as usual. It's running into trouble. It ends in a hard way.
Well, you get even more pain with path A.
You always get more pain. And the problem with political elites is they don't like to admit to any failings. So what do? They like to blame people. So They'll blame China, they'll blame Russia, they'll blame somebody, get into a nice war. Our view is this next war, that if we get into one, will be so devastating, there really won't be a recovery from it, because unlike the prior two world wars, those we had ample resources as a fuel source to help us recover from those injuries. This time, a lot of the destruction may well just prove to be rather permanent and unrecoverable. So we really need intelligence. We have predicaments we're facing. It's time for intelligent people to begin facing them square on. And that's why you and I are having this conversation, because there's not a lot of intelligent conversation happening yet at the upper political levels. And that's why I really love that young 16-year-old Greta Thunberg, who stepped into Davos and basically told him truth to power straight up, like kids can sometimes, and said, it's time to panic, and that was great direct language, which I think they really needed to hear there, because Davos has become, as far as I can tell, completely irrelevant. They're talking about, they were all excited about scientists developing enzymes to eat plastic bottles and drones that can deliver books to school children in Indonesia, and just random stuff. There's literally it's just feel good, waste your time stuff, when the world is burning right now with injustice, with ecological insults, and with an out of control debt machine that the central banks are just insisting is the best thing for everybody, when it clearly isn't.
I just had Daniel Estulin on. I think it's funny that you said the same thing he did. At the end of the interview, I didn't include this in the interview. I said, I forgot to ask you about Davos and why nobody's going. He said, it's not important. It's that the reason why Macron and May and Trump, they aren't going, is because these people don't have the same power they used to. They're not important. And that's what you just said, that Davos really isn't that important. Right?
Yeah, it's just gotten, it got too big for itself, I guess, and sort of it seems to have devolved into, just a bunch of panels where people are all saying like stuff on panels. Nothing's coming out of that where you can look at it and say they actually have their finger on the real pulse of what's really important, right? So it happens, the conferences, sometimes get a little off track, and I guess Davos seems to have gotten that way. There'll be another one that'll come up at some point, but the point is that the elites, though, are just wildly out of touch, and they only tend to talk to themselves. So they're really just, it's like Larry Summers talking about, with the experience of the average person. It's so embarrassingly out of touch. He has no clue really what's going on. Yeah. And that's really, where they've gotten to. So the echo chamber needs to be burst, and it's happening. And again, to bring it back, that's why the yellow vests are not being publicized. I mean, anybody listening to this, check your newspaper. If what was happening in Paris was happening in Moscow,
people. It's huge. It's not just
in Moscow. Yeah, you'd hear about it 24/7 on CNN. If Putin was doing what the French police thugs are doing to their own populace, it would be all over the news constantly, because hey, we want to make Russia look bad. But because it's happening in Paris, that's a little confusing, because those are our people, and people are supposed to love their governments, and the media is typically just stenographers for the government at this point in time, right?
And so this is what people, socialism works, really? Well, France is socialism, crackdown on press. UK is socialism, crackdown on press. Germany is socialism, crackdown on press. They're all cracking down on the press. They don't want, you could go to jail for mentioning, and the reason why they're raising the taxes because this giant immigration movement, and these people come in and say, hey, we're here, y'all. Time for you to pay for us. So they raise their taxes to pay for this craziness, right?
Yep. Well, it's true, and the U.S. press is in no better shape at this particular point in time. So,
well, we have the alternative media. I mean, at least people like me are out there. There couldn't be French watchdog. That wouldn't happen. There couldn't be USA watchdog. That would not happen. They would come to your house and haul you away like Tommy Robinson. The same thing with Germany. That would not happen. Same thing in China and all these places.
It's true, and I'm actually concerned now that because of the things I've talked about openly, that I'm no longer, I'm going to think carefully before I travel to some countries now. I don't think that there are places that I would be welcome anymore, right?
Wow.
Because I could run afoul of certain laws. There's things like what you just said about immigrants, that may be illegal under German law. I'm not clear on that at this point in time, right? Because you're not actually allowed to talk about ideas anymore. And that's really an important point. This is where we are in this conversation now, that for the elites, whether they happen to be, in any country you want to talk about, that there are ideas now that they consider to be so dangerous that you can't talk about them, right?
Well, like our border wall. I mean, who pays for that? Who pays for this massive amount of humanity coming into? I mean, I'll tell you what, the black population in America, they're in the bottom rung. They're competing against people that are getting asylum, which is total BS about 99% of the time, and people who are illegal immigrants. They're competing with they're being vaulted higher than our own citizens. And I don't care who you are, what color you are. I mean, somebody's going to have to pay for that. And what 60 some odd percent of these folks that are coming in can't support themselves, so taxpayers support them. I mean, who's making that decision for us? Oh, walls are immoral. Well, I think me paying for somebody else sitting on their tail is more immoral, or somebody come here and dropping a kid is immoral. And then having somebody else pay for it. A dreamer's, it's great. You can have a dream. Why don't you pay for it? Anyway, I went off on it. But that's what we're talking about here. What they're trying to do is destroy countries with this immigration movement, no matter where they're from.
Well, it's interesting, again, leaving aside whether it's moral or immoral, I can tell you this, that immigration is not it's a zero-sum game. It is a zero-sum game. It has winners and losers. So for an immigrant coming into a more economically advanced country, that's a win. Well, did they just win? Oh, no, somebody had to lose. So who lost? Well, the people who they're competing with those jobs for, the wage pressure that gets brought down, pushing down wages, all of that. And so the people who are saying that the wall is immoral, first, they're not recognizing that the United States supports tons of countries that have plenty of walls. Israel, Jordan, people, if you can't control who's in and outside of your country, you don't really have national sovereignty for starters. So I can tell you this for a fact. If you as an American tried to go to any one of these other countries and just live there, you'd discover they have rules. They've got visas. They've got rules about how long you can stay. They've got rules about when you can work or how you can work, all kinds of stuff, right? So that's just normal. But when we look at this game right now, the people who are most clearly advocating this idea that walls are immoral are typically the ones who benefit from having people come in and be their gardeners, their cooks, and low forms of wages and labor. It's no surprise. So again, if we just look at these things in terms of winners and losers, it's very easy to understand what's happening. And our prediction is we're going to see more and more of that going forward because we have a world with too much debt, too few resources to grow the way we're supposed to grow, and entrenched bureaucracies like the Federal Reserve and other central banks and other entities like that, whose job it is to continue to funnel money and resources from some people and towards others. And they do it in a way that's pretty unfair, and that's what never gets talked about in the media. So when I say the United States has a controlled media, they commit sins of both commission when they overtly lie about things, but more importantly, sins of omission about the things that they just don't talk about. So in the weekend, when Davos was kicking off, do you know what the most talked about thing in our media cycle here was? It was about some high school kids in a MAGA hat in the Washington Mall getting into some sort of a manufactured tiff with a Native American elder and some other protesters. That was it. And so while we were spending an entire huge amounts of news cycles and emotional excitement around that event, nobody, coincidentally, seemed to be talking about what was going on over in the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. What a coincidence, right?
Where they should be panicking, where a little girl says, you should panic.
Correct. There's really important things we ought to be talking about, and people were absolutely inflamed in my country. I couldn't get it off my Twitter feed. I was just like swamped with these Covington High. And maybe there's some issues here that deserve to be talked about, but it's like Z10 on my priority scale. Number one, where are the insects? What's happening to all the ancient trees? What's happening to the phytoplankton in the ocean? Maybe we should know about these things. What's the United States energy policy? There's really important things that need to be talked about. They're not being talked about, which is why, again, we hold our conference because, intelligent people ought to get together and talk about this stuff and develop their own plans for who they want to be and how they want to act and what sort of preparations they want to make, because the world is going this way and maybe it ought to be going that way.
I want to talk about one last question before we talk about your conference. It's at the end of April. But I want to talk about gold and silver. It's, wow, quite a bit. somebody panicked last Friday, and it went up, I don't know, 20 something dollars, and then up again. And it looks like somebody is panicking. What's your read? It's not silver, not as much. I still think it's super cheap. Although I don't give investment advice, but although I think everybody should have something other than paper wealth. But what do you suppose is going on in the gold and silver market right now? Why all of a sudden somebody's thumb slipped off the scale and it's allowed to go up?
Well, this is, my view is that our markets need air quotes around maybe a double set air quotes, because they're not really markets anymore. A market is a place where willing buyers and sellers come and engage in this thing called price discovery. When we say the price of gold, what we're really referring to is a price that's set in the comics papers futures market, where no gold actually trades hands. And this is true for a lot of commodities, and it's true across all the leveraged paper product markets out there, including puts, calls, and other options on stocks and bonds and everything. So our view is that gold is one of the most manipulated markets out there, and it's used by various players to harvest money. And so they've been doing this for a really long time, and so that's a lot of the signal that we see in the price of gold is just the big bullion banks just playing games, right? And they've been doing it for a long time. They're very good at it. Meanwhile, we've been seeing some really interesting things in the palladium market, where we saw palladium actually get higher in price than gold. It's a very small market. It actually ran into legitimate supply and demand difficulties. I don't think those are resolved yet. And so that could be something that begins to put a warning shot across the bow, where something that gold bugs have been waiting for a long time is a legitimate failure of this mispricing mechanism that's the paper market, resulting in an actual physical supply problem. And if that happens, that's where it's kind of game over for the paper pushers, for the players that are out there manipulating these markets. And by the way, we've had how many revelations that the London gold fix has been manipulated and blah, blah, blah. I'm sure you've talked about it plenty on your program, right? There's just tons of games being played in that market. So with that as a background, we now see that the central banks are engaging in they're throwing in the towel. They've caved. They're ready to go back to the whole print-a-thon thing. That's deeply concerning, because it means that the world can't even manage to sustain. The financial world can't even manage them stopping their purchases, let alone reversing them without them panicking. That's a bad sign. Let me, paraphrase a 16-year-old from Davos. When your central banks can't even flatten out their balance sheet purchases, you should be panicking.
Wow, you can't. That's a very important point. They can't even stop the printing. They can't even stop. They can't just say, "Okay, we're going to stop," without the whole thing falling to pieces.
Right.
Wow.
I mean, what do you make of that? I mean, we all have to interpret the signs how we can. So I look at insects collapsing. I look at those signs. I just look at those and I say, I don't need to wait for the Wall Street Journal to tell me how to feel about that. I'll make up my own mind about that, and we'll go from there.
That's a simple revelation. They can't even stop the money printing. They can't stop the manipulation, the intervention, without the whole thing blowing up. Maybe that's why gold's going up.
I believe it is, because for me, Greg, gold is not. It's not a great inflation hedge. I don't buy it because of inflation. I buy it as the only form of money that's not simultaneously somebody else's liability. We're talking about a world so saddled with debt, I don't know where the liabilities actually lie. I don't trust the GAAP or non-GAAP accounting of major corporations. I don't trust that I know what the derivatives market really will do in a crisis. Nobody knows any of that stuff. All we know is that we've printed up about 100 trillion of new debt. We've gotten a very tiny amount of additional economic growth out of that, and we're coming into a period where that's all going to have to reverse at some point. Hey, recessions happen, they're normal, but credit bubbles, we've only been through two before, 2000 and 2007. Those were the peaks of the prior credit bubbles. If this one reverses, this was the everything bubble. What happens when the everything bubble bursts? We don't know. Right? So gold to me is the thing I want to own or hold when you have a systemic crisis. That's what I think it's signaling at this point in time, is there's additional concern around a systemic crisis. My advice to anybody when it comes to gold is, though, don't wait to read about the systemic crisis in the Wall Street Journal, because by then it's too late. And you know who's at the front of the line for buying available gold and silver when the time comes? Won't be you and me. It'll be the Davos crowd. It'll be the billionaires. They'll have the better access. And access will be everything at some point, if I'm right.
I have one sponsor. I just want to add this because I was just while you were talking about this. I have just one sponsor. I only have her because she's honest. She just pays me a monthly fee, and I never hear, "Oh, they rip me off." I don't hear that. I don't hear that from her. That's why she's on. Otherwise, if she did, I'd send her money back. But I'm putting this at the end of this interview at her discount gold and silver trading, Melody Cedarstrom, and her number. And the reason why I'm doing that is because I've had a lot of people ask me about, I want to know about gold and silver. Where can I buy gold or silver, physical gold and silver coins? Where can I buy it? I mean, people are freaking out. I mean, they're sending me emails. They're making comments on the YouTube channel. I think people feel that something is wrong. Right? I mean, people that have never, I mean, I had one woman say, I've never bought it before, but I want to cash out, and I can't tell her to do that, but I want to cash out an IRA, and tell me where I could buy it. Okay, we'll go to my sponsor. But people are feeling something is wrong, right? I mean, that's why you're having this conference in April, that something is wrong, and you want to say, yep, something is wrong. And that's kind of a moving target of information. You're absolutely compiling more and more information. Tell me about your conference at the end of April, where you're obviously something's wrong, and you're telling people how to fight it or what to do to put yourself in the best position. Hit me. Tell me about your conference. What's the name of it? When is it?
Absolutely, Greg. Would love to, and thank you for that wonderful intro, because this is the two most important words I ever want to convey to anybody is trust yourself. Right? If you know something's wrong, that's all you need. Don't wait for confirmation. Don't wait for your friends, loved ones, colleagues, newspaper, TV to tell you that. If you already know something's wrong, great. That's the starting point. So trust yourself. Don't even trust me. Don't trust anybody else. Trust yourself. And if you've decided things are not right and you want to begin to know what do you do about that, that's where our conference comes in. Because, we've got the crash course and we've got all our writings. We don't spend a lot of time going into what I call problem definition, which is let's show all the ways the world is goofy and wrong. We'll spend a little time on that just to make sure everybody's on the same page and cover some of the latest things that have happened. But that'll be Friday morning, April 26th, and that's when it kicks off. We'll spend maybe, an hour or two saying, hey, here's the state of the world. And then after that, it's all, what do you do? And that's really wrapped around what we call the 8 forms of capital, that people who are truly resilient will be rich in all 8 forms of capital. Financial capital, everybody's familiar with that. We spend a good amount of time on that. But there are 7 other forms of capital, and that includes your emotional capital, very important. And because if you're going to fall apart when everything starts to get a little tough, I don't care how resilient you are, you're out of the game. So we spend time on emotional capital, your living capital, which is the ecosystem around you and your own health and your body. Material capital, which could be things like the solar panels or a deep pantry or things like that you can make as investments in yourself, and things like that. So we cover these 8 forms of capital, and the most important part, the best feedback we get from everybody is that they love the content, Greg. We get really high marks on that. But they say the best part is meeting the other people who are like them, who are talking about this. They're all smart. They're very successful. And it's just wonderful to get that tribe of people together. That's really its largest value.
When is the conference? Where is it? It's end of April. And where is it?
In Sebastopol, California. And if you come to peakprosperity.com, we've got a big banner up top running right now. There is an early bird special there for pricing, but we'll make it very easy for people to get there. And if you need a more direct link to, always peakprosperity.com/
I'm going to put your webpage up. But go ahead. Go ahead.
Peakprosperity.com/seminar. You get right there, and it's good to go.
And you know what I hear a lot too? People will write me and say, my family thinks I'm crazy. My family thinks I'm crazy. Yeah. They think there's just nothing wrong. They're like, well, what's the football game? The Super Bowl. I'm going to watch the Super Bowl this weekend, which I'm going to boycott because I despise the Marxism that Robert Goodell has brought to the Super Bowl. Social justice. And but neither here nor there. But do you hear a lot from your people saying, my family thinks I'm a lunatic. They think I'm nuts. They think I'm doom and gloom. They think that I'm way, way overreacting. This has been going on for 10 years. This is good. I mean, financial crisis over. Do you hear that a lot from people? And what do you tell them?
Well, we do, and it's one of the number one things that we focus on in the seminars. That sense of isolation. So people feel kind of alone with this. And what we've learned over the years, Greg, is that the number of people who are actually capable of looking at this information is low. And it's a fairly rare select group of people. We think that gives them a special responsibility because not everybody can look at this. Not everybody's ready to be the ant and the grasshopper in this story and ready to be the ant like that most people are going to do what the center mass of humanity is doing. But for the people who are capable of being early adopters, of seeing the signs, of interpreting them for themselves and deciding for themselves how they want to conduct themselves given that. That's always a trailblazing, rare kind of a group of people. So this is really around when people get together, they get inspired. They see that other people are doing this. The number of people who've taken extraordinary actions in their own lives to be leaders, to make resilient homesteads, to be the people who are showing the way of how we can connect our actions with what we know about how the world is operating. To connect those two things together I think we're still kind of at the early adopter, but boy, it's catching on quick. And by the way, when we do this, there are always invariably a number of very wealthy people who show up. And by the way, they've been making preparations for a long time very elaborate preparations because, I don't know, maybe they've had access to different information or they're used to building, being entrepreneurs and thinking for themselves and building in different ways. Whatever the reason is, this just hasn't been marketed yet to the middle class as a thing they need to do. But boy, it's a really important thing because the signs of the collapse are around us, and this is the number one reason people don't feel okay right now. Like, wait, joblessness at lows, and not just lows, but lows since the 60s, and I'm told the economy's doing well, and why do I feel this way? Well, it's probably because you've registered on some level that you don't see bugs on your windshield anymore, and that's not a good sign. Or you haven't heard the birds in the morning in spring, and that's not a good sign. These are all signs saying that the change in trend is coming, and you want to be in front of that, not behind it. And you can ignore that, or you can face it. Those are your choices right now.
Chris Martenson, peakprosperity.com. I'm going to put all this is on the front page of your the homepage of peakprosperity.com. This is the book you'll find on there too. It's also been all redone. Second edition of that book. Peakprosperity.com. The conference is right up top of the homepage. Chris Martenson, thank you for joining us today on USAWatchdog.com.
My pleasure, Greg.